Right, so thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm delighted to welcome David Gange, who is a historian at the University of Birmingham. His work includes research on the uses of the past and temporalities, particularly in coastal spaces and small language communities. His account of a year kayaking from Shetland to Cornwall, the Frayed Edge, was a winner of the Highland Book Prize. Since then, he's spent a lot of time in boat workshops, thinking through some hands-on approaches to historical practice. And the last time he was here, you were finishing off your PhD. So it's good to come full circle. And I'll let you explain more about this.
Great, thanks a lot. Not even finishing off my PhD. The very first talk that I gave during my PhD was at this university, and I haven't been here since. So it's really nice to be back. So yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks so much for coming along. I'm not either an ancient historian or an archaeologist, and the project I'm going to be talking about today isn't kind of either of those things. So I hope it's going to have enough kind of points of connection to be interesting to you, and it's going to be really interesting for me to hear from some people who are using kind of archaeological things and material things every day. So I'm going to be talking about quite a few places around the North Atlantic, and all of them are ones that have had major cultural revivals since the 1970s. So the 1970s is a really kind of resonant decade for all of them. And these revivals have been about restoring dignity to particular localized traditions, which were kind of marginalized in what were really the dark ages of these places, those dark ages being around the 1780s to around the 1960s. And these revivals involved lots and lots of political activism, which is their best studied aspect in books like these two. But the other parts of the revivals have often kind of seen less focus. So they introduced a kind of new belief in orality and poetry as kind of being equal to literacy and to texts. And kind of often recovering whole lexicons of place-based, ecologically rich language. And they also involved a huge emphasis on material culture as a point of access in the past. So a way of turning local coastal pasts from things to be embarrassed about to things to take pride in. So this involved excavations that essentially kind of vindicated oral history against textual scholarship, like the amazing one at Dunashton on the Isle of Lewis, and projects that made kind of belittled material conditions heroic, like Tim Severin's famous Brendan Voyage project. And part of what I'm going to be trying to show today is that small traditional boats have been the prestige objects in really future-focused kind of reconnections with the distant past. So as kind of one example of this, in the 1960s, all of the artworks made by Greenland's national kayak artist, known as Aaron from Gange, they were all held in Denmark, and putting kayaks on museum display was a really kind of colonial thing to do. And the very first steps towards self-determination involved almost all of Aaron's work and several historic kayaks being returned from Amsterdam and Copenhagen in the late 1970s. And within a couple of years, a few young Greenlanders, kind of inspired by the boats on display, had started building kayaks again. And by the 80s, there were hundreds of people owning T-shirts with this slogan on it, which essentially means kayak, we are using it again. So the boats become symbolic of a kind of negotiation between Greenland's culture and pressures to be a global industrial society. Kati Fredriksson, for instance, is a poet and a kayaker, and was Greenland Minister for Education, as well as holding the national marathon record. And she writes of how Greenlanders of her grandparents' generation were taught by colonial education to be ignorant of how advanced they really were. And in her Greenlandic language poetry, kayaks always symbolize attachment to Inuit tradition and Inuit values. One of her most powerful poems, the kind of opening of it is here, it's a really long poem. It has a man who's forced to relocate from his little home bay to a town. And when his daughter gets pregnant, he expects the kind of old kind of cultural family structures and obligations to operate. And he breaks up his kayak to make toys for his grandchild, but then begins to dream of his kayak capsizing and to recognize the breach between his expectations and the realities of urban life. And that kind of symbolizes, or that kind of symbolism rather, can be found in lots and lots of poetry throughout the Inuit world. so Dugnannock Ockpicks, Inupiaq women, approaches these kind of entanglements of the kind of joys and hardships of living in those multiple temporalities through that image of the kayak. So the poem opens with a kayaker paddling out past salt flats to find still fishing waters, and her windburned face a sign of her subsistence for her young family. And she says, kind of in body, in Inuit, she thrives on the bleakest ecstatic love. Here on her knees in her sealskin buoyant boat, her duties of her village complete, she knows her place among the caribou women. But her children who will eat her catch are kind of indoors with their headphones on. They live in the time frame of the music that they hear, which locks them in step with the singles charts of the US. And they don't live in the time frame of the kayak or the sacred time of local rivers. So as it heads kind of further down, they will not follow her in the knowledge of ice, dressing a caribou, preparing dry fish, jarring jellies, dip netting hooligans, purse netting whitefish, tracking and setting traps for marmot, squirrels, Arctic fox, and wolverine. And then for a second example of this kind of revival, we can cross the Atlantic. So the Shetland Islands have also seen poets and boat builders lead the ongoing cultural revival that began in the 1970s. And they too have really focused on that link between orality and materiality. And perhaps the most kind of resonant image in all of Shetland literature is the shore mile. So the space, as Robert Allen Jamieson puts it, the space between the tides where the moon weighs the density of the ocean, a symbol for the flow and ebb of language and culture. So Jamieson emerged as a poet at exactly that kind of 70s moment of revival. And then his current successors, like Roseanne Watt, continue his themes of kind of linguistic distinctiveness and materiality as being twin links to a past that's actually kind of really, really difficult to research. So Watt writes of language and culture as kind of drenched with seawater, as in the poem that we have some of here called Salt in the Blood, where one Shetlander admonishes another for having proppered your tongue by, or having parched your tongue rather, by proppering words into English and losing, I'm not going to try and pronounce it in any kind of Shetland accent, but losing the language that could capture the percussion of waves on its consonants. The speaker reminds the listener that the salt that courses through your veins is the life's blood of an older conversation, one that ebbs and flows just as the tide. And then in the poem Raga Tree, Watt explores the idea of Shetland history as being a rootless tree, kind of driftwood rootless tree. So the dialect in Shetland emerged in the 1860s. This might be a history that people don't know, that I don't know, but the dialect emerged in the 1860s. And Shetland before that had a language called Norn that died out in the 18th century. We have some of a lexicon of Norn. We really don't know how the grammar works. We have very, very little actual text whatsoever. So these poems are kind of about the ways in which writing Shetland history is to be kind of adrift, to not have a kind of textual past to link up with. So the language kind of shaped by loss is being talked about as driftwood, with its roots having been worn away by ocean. So to see me is to see an absent world caught between seaweed and old nets. You wouldn't find me here, not as I once was. See, I was brought here by tides. The sea voyage made me strange, made black tentacles of my roots, twisted my body with the green of porphyry. What I was, I hardly remember. Don't ask me. Leave me. I have no time for your lost gods. My bows won't be gallows here. So Watt writes that at first she was really kind of intimidated by the absence of those roots, but gradually came to recognize the kind of condition of this void that is Shetland history as rich with potential. So the void as a kind of creative space. And throughout her work, objects of wood, stone, reed, twine, seashell are conjured as things to kind of fill that void, as the things like an Arctic turnstile, for instance, being the one way of kind of filling the void. And it's the recovery of a lexicon with entirely different material priorities, so hundreds of words for seaweed and for boat parts, for instance, and that's where island history kind of really lies. It's part of what she's saying. So yeah, on thousands of miles of shoreline and in countless small languages, making sense of coastal cultures on their own terms has meant poets and craftspeople reconceptualizing those textual voids as creative spaces. A few of the traditions that I'll be mentioning, a few of the boat traditions have kind of their historians or their archaeologists, but all of them have their poets because of that connection to orality. And so it's generally a deeply material poetry of loss and rediscovery that comes from the moment of the tradition's revival, written by poets who, even if they write in English, live through the small languages. So like Moya Cannon's early poetry, for instance, Moya Cannon is an Irish poet who kind of lives through the Irish language, though she writes in English, contains kind of all of the major styles of Irish boat. So here is her poem about the Galway hooker on the left and the curragh on the right, although I'm not going to read these. We'll get off the poetry into the boats very soon. And the great cartographer of the Irish shore, Tim Robinson, described his method in similar terms to this kind of idea of void as creative space. So saying that his efforts to comprehend the past culture of the Aran Islands weren't those of a historian because they weren't compatible with the kind of Enlightenment idea of shining light into the past and constructing these kind of strings of cause and effect. Instead, he said, his engagement with craft and language and landscape marks some points of attachment to the historical web from which one can grope back along the strands into the darkness. So exploring these revivals and how they function in terms of what we can know about the past is a really important part of the project that I'm trying to do, but so is the kind of past itself and the question of how a historian or anyone else invested in these pasts might try and know it. So to give an example of the kinds of problems that this is confronting, this is one of my favourite places on Earth. It's called Loch an Stroim, and it's many miles from any kind of road or modern community. I'll put some maps up too, kind of on the west coast of Lewis. Sorry about the kind of severe amateurism of these maps. There will be some proper ones made soon, but not quite yet. But yeah, this is Loch an Stroim here, and embedded in a bigger map and a still bigger map. So yeah, Miles Money Road, but just kind of a really, really, really rich spot. So the bay is just absolutely brimming with oysters and scallops down here. There's kind of amazing, like the loch just around the corner was famed for its kind of herring fishing and its salmon fishing. You can get miles and miles from here in really kind of well-protected waters. It was just a really kind of rich place to live. And it has a huge archival presence just from one moment, just from the 1830s. It's the only decade it has any real archival presence from at all. And it only appears in the archive when conceptualized as a problem by a really unpleasant character from Inverness, who was given sheep farming on the opposite side of the loch by Lord Seaforth. And he in 1833, wrote to Lord Seaforth asking to clear the community. And yeah, this letter was enough to clear the community. Within like 2 years of this letter being written, there was no one living at Loch an Stroim, and there has been no one living there since. Local tradition holds that some of the people who lived here were forced to live under their upturned boats on the beaches of Ness to the north, miles to the north. And this moment was also used to smash up the little mills. You can find kind of lots of millstones in some kind of places up here. These mills were absolutely crucial to localized life. So Seaforth got people to kind of go in and smash up the little mills so that people had to use the commercial mills in the town. So these mills and the boats that people kind of lived under at that moment have become really symbolic of a moment when a kind of Lewis way of life was kind of really damaged and almost destroyed kind of overnight by this attempt to kind of commercialize the space. So yeah, everything that we have about this spot in text is from the perspective of those people who kind of cleared it, and the question of how on earth we can interpret the place through how it was understood by the people who actually lived there. How do we place them at the centre and put McCrae and Seaforth kind of at the margins of any story that we tell about this? Then there's a kind of different motivating factor to this work too, which is that there's a kind of odd repeated phenomenon in the literature of little boats. So lots of writers on specific boat styles, many of whom were part of those 1970s revivals, have published one volume on the technical aspects of a boat, while promising another that would elaborate the kind of cultural spheres that the boats made possible, kind of placing a boat in the life of its communities. So here's an example from the great kayak historian H.C. Peterson. This is how he put it in a kind of classic book on the technical aspects of kayaks, of Greenland and umayaks. He wrote, "I've divided the work up into two parts, the first being this book, a description of the kayak and umayak and their gear, the description of the cultural area which the kayak has created in the lives of the Inuits. I hope to have the necessary time to prepare at a later date." As I imagine you're probably guessing I'm about to say, every time that this sequence has been promised, Volume 1 has been an absolute masterpiece and Volume 2 has never been written. So Peterson never wrote that text, and it would be utterly amazing if he had. He kind of passed away with all of that knowledge kind of lost. So yeah, the book that all of this relates to is, or that I'm kind of putting together, or have kind of put together, and I'm in the stage of doing the kind of substantive edits on, it's called Afloat, and it features 8 regions. Again, sorry about the bad map. So Connemara in the west of Ireland, and Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, and then the very north of Norway, or Sapmi, and the Faroe Islands, and West Greenland, Northeast Newfoundland, Maine and Massachusetts, and Barbados. So a span of the North Atlantic from one end of the Gulf Stream to the other, that kind of being the logic, taking that route to reach the opposite end of the Gulf Stream. So all of the chapters for it involved extensive journeys in little traditional rowed or paddled boats. So this was my boat in northern Norway, for instance, and lots of time with local boat builders. So arriving at boat workshops by water, and then often helping out with the boat building. I say helping out, but being kind of a hindrance while trying to learn things, gradually finding that their expectations of the jobs that they could allow me to do went down and down until I was just mainly using sandpaper in most kind of places. But yeah, learning everything that I could from the boat builders about the kinds of things they do and how they see the world. But to be able to get to the kinds of key historic sites, there were also a lot of long journeys in either my sea kayak or my tiny 1 kilogram travel kayak that just kind of goes in the bottom of the rucksack and then can be kind of taken out for days at a time. So yeah, lots of time rowing or paddling out to the mountainous islands, through ice flows, spending as many nights as possible in my little kind of waterproof sleeping bag, or in the coldest places in my little yellow tent, trying to piece together local stories about how these coasts were used, following routes that kind of past communities used, with their kind of seasonal movements and things, trying to see the water and coastal species and the land in ways inflected as far as possible by local engagement with them. And obviously, kind of stressing the small boat as the medium of that kind of engagement. And it's worth kind of stressing the significance of these kind of boats, I think. So extremely, extremely numerous. So wherever there are surveys, so like 19th century Ireland had kind of boat surveys, as did Newfoundland. We're talking about kind of thousands or tens of thousands of small boats within limited geographies. Kind of their archival presence so much less than the presence of big ships, but their numbers so much bigger. So so the Irish surveys, for instance, break boats down by type, and 2% of boats in the first survey, should have actually put the date here of when that survey was. I think that again is 1830s. 2% of boats then was kind of decked sailing ships. 73% was small undecked rowing boats. But of course, yeah, the decked sailing ships, 99% or more of the archival record. So yeah, these boats are kind of really embody kind of specific engagements, often with really limited geographies. Really kind of localized things, like just the shapes that local boats taking being defined by one specific local headland or something like that, or even as in somewhere like Macladalor in Faroe, by the fact that every boat made. So this is a major boat building centre, but every boat made had to be brought down the cliff like this. So that kind of defined the shape that the boats had. They had shorter keels than other boats nearby, but really, really sturdy keels, which also meant that they were famous for being really, really good in really rough seas. The short keel working to mean that a kind of following sea couldn't kind of spin them or anything like that. So they were famous for their seaworthiness as well as for the ruggedness they had to have even just for their launch. So yeah, small quirks of form defined by lots of these kind of things, and everyone in a different Faroe Islands village would know a Macladalor boat by sight instantly because of those characteristics. So really direct expressions of the landscapes through their shape, but also through what they're made of. So lots of the boats made just from very local resources, like the Sami boat being essentially completely pine tree, using pine as, instead of nails, your pine root to sew, using pine resin to seal, just nothing but pine. And really kind of embedded in informal economies as well, made by the communities who used them, owned by the communities who used them, not requiring harbours or even jetties or boat houses, most of them being kind of built outdoors like this, not even with specialist tools. So the tools for making a boat usually shared with the coffin maker, for instance. And yeah, that's another reason why they simply do not appear in textual archives in the way we kind of might hope, just not documented in text. And that's also why they kind of hardly ever appear in maritime history, and why I often think of the things that I'm doing as being the opposite of maritime history rather than part of maritime history. And yeah, in some places, building the boat involved every single member of the community. And yeah, a seasonal task often done through the winter or early in the spring before driftwood had been kind of weakened by goose barnacles or kind of other kind of creatures like that. And also kind of boats that are accorded the most phenomenal prestige within their communities. So one thing that's common to these cultures is the idea that the boats are alive, that they have individual identities, that they make their own decisions, and kind of facing a life or death choice. In lots and lots of the stories of them, you listen to the boat, and if you don't listen to the boat, essentially you're in all kinds of trouble. And one of the richest parts of the research for this project was speaking to old retired boat builders, often in care homes, or being given reports of things that they'd said. And some of their phrases are just kind of really, really evocative, I think. So boats have their own brains, their own way of moving, their own music, or a boat is the nearest thing that you can build to something that's living. And there are countless examples of people talking about boats sulking because disrespected, a boat holding a grudge for decades because someone tried to take it out when drunk. But everyone knows that they also kind of reward any kind of trust that's placed in them. So they're treated as members of the family, still often treated as members of the family in places like Connemara today. And families become very, very closely associated with their boats as well. So there are several people in some parts of this book where the name of the boat is just the name that they're known by instead of their surname. So in a traditional boat like these, each kind of part moves almost kind of independently with the water. So the kinds of words to praise a good boat are often terms like dancing or lithe or flowing or lyrical. They're about kind of flex more than about rigidity, about lightness more than about strength. So the boats kind of are written about a shifting shape with the waves in ways that make them feel like a link to the sea rather than a barrier against it. And their shape at the waterline kind of self-consciously imitates the shape of fish or other kind of sea creatures or cetaceans. And it often matters to boat builders too that it's the sea itself that animates the boat. It's thought of as being inanimate until it's put in the water, then the water flows through its grain like blood through veins. And yeah, if you let a keel of one of these boats dry out, you are in trouble. So yeah, I thought I'd introduce, just for the kind of last part of my talk, 4 case studies of these boats, which are the first 4 boats in the project, the first 4 chapters, and kind of just talk a little bit about what they're calculated to bring to the project. Whether we'll get to the 4th, I don't know, but hopefully they should illustrate kind of what these boats might do for us. So the first boat belongs to this small region, the islands of South Connemara. So an extremely kind of rocky place, different planet from the agrarian economy of mainland Ireland, but culturally rich beyond compare, and also at the absolute heart of the Irish language. So there's been a huge revival in the traditional sailing boats. Thought I'd put a picture of one of the traditional sailing boats there. You'll see them in a moment anyway. So yeah, a huge revival of the traditional sailing boats called the Galway hookers since the 1970s. But even here, the boat that I've been writing about is almost completely forgotten. So when I asked one of the leading boat builders about this boat, his response was, "Why are you interested in those? No one ever asks about those. That's the donkey boat." But I think that actually sums up kind of why I am interested in it. So yeah, it's a boat called the Bord Omra, and it no longer exists really, though this boat that I was allowed to kind of help on for a bit is pretty much one before it has a mast put in. So this is now a boat called a puchan, which is essentially like a Bord Omra, but with kind of weatherboards and a mast. So for the beginning of its life, it could have been a Bord Omra. So yeah, one of the things that happened is that when the leisure revival began, all the Bord Omras were cut in half, kind of little bits added, masts put in, so that they could be puchans for racing. But we'll get onto that kind of issue in a minute anyway. So yeah, every single boat survey of this region has had a weird amnesia about the Bord Omra. They all contain phrases like this. So this is from the most recent one. It says, the number of Bord Omra, 44, 9% of the total boats surveyed. So this is of the kind of shells of boats found at the waterline. This is a Bord Omra at the front here. Came as a surprise to the survey team, even those with an intimate knowledge of the area and its boats. You look back at each previous boat survey, and it contains something really similar. You can absolutely guarantee that the next boat survey will also express lots of surprise that there were any Bord Omra at all. And I think that kind of repeated amnesia deserves some kind of explanation. Even with the help of local boat builders, I've only found one book or article where the boat features for more than one sentence. And that's a description of a race in 1934. And on that day, the weather was rough and there was lots of clashing and splintering of wood. But a Bord Omra mustered all the speed she had to defeat every local curragh. And it's worth stressing, this is a boat that's kind of slower and clumsier than a curragh in calm. One reason they used in this rocky area is because curraghs would be kind of shredded instantly by these kind of rocks, and the Bord Omra is stronger, but also kind of far less affected by rough seas, so more able to tackle stormy oceans. And yeah, as far as print or archives go, that kind of one mention and the kind of these kind of mentions in the boat surveys are pretty much it. But Connemara is most definitely a storytelling culture, as people might know. And so conversations with local boat builders are where researching this has to begin. Here's how Tim Robinson put the Connemara kind of storytelling culture. Connemara tradition is so voluble in story, song, and place name that one wonders if days and nights were longer formerly to hear all that was said and sung in them. So yeah, to explain what this boat is, it is essentially a Galway hooker. So these are the staggeringly elegant workboats of Galway Bay that carried peat and fish and people and everything else around the little world of Galway and Connemara and the Burren and the Aran Islands. So since the 1970s, if you look at a list of types of Galway hooker, that list will contain 4 boats, which are sailboats of various sizes, each of which is kind of raced in these races every year. But if you look at a similar list from before 1940, there are 5 boats, not 4. And the 5th is the road Galway hooker, the Galway hooker with no mast and no sail, the Bord Omra, which, much like a donkey, was utterly crucial to life on these kind of regions of rugged shores. So yeah, curraghs are light and they can be rowed with 8-foot oars. Anyone can get in one and give it a go, even if they might spin around a bit. But the bord omra, despite being kind of extremely elegant, just as elegant as all of the bigger boats, same lines as the bigger boats, was a kind of absolute beast. It could carry a ton, which you'd need quite a few curraghs to do. And it needed enormous 18-foot oars. So 18-foot oars compared to the 8-foot oars of a curragh. So only people who are using these boats day in, day out, kind of building the specific strengths to be able to use them, would be able to. So yeah, local stories are full of kind of formidable past people, like one woman from the island of Furnish, who, when her waters were breaking, sailed to the mainland for medical help, rowed to the mainland for medical help in a bord omra on her own. So there's lots of kind of stories like that of them. But in the kind of leisure tradition, all of their strengths kind of become weaknesses. So no one goes out in the leisure tradition in the kinds of conditions where bord omras work best. And yeah, people just don't build that kind of strength to use them. So that's why in the 1970s, most of them were just sawed in half to be used in regattas as sailboats, or just kind of left to kind of rot at the shoreline. So that's the best condition I have ever seen a bord omra in. There will probably never again be a bord omra in a better condition than that. So yeah, my ways of researching this vessel involved time in those Galway hooker workshops, wandering the islands with boat builders who took me to kind of every wreck of the bord omra, including that one. So I spent lots of time at the regattas where people kind of celebrate their boats and their communities, and then headed on a little pilgrimage that gets, I forgot, there are more pictures, the pictures of the Roundscombe Regatta, and then the pilgrimage to St. Macdara's Island that happens every year. So getting in one of the little wooden boats, one of the kind of wooden curraghs, to head out to the island for the kind of annual pilgrimage, which is just absolutely surrounded with stories. And it's had the odd kind of anthropological or sociological essay written about it, but all of them really shockingly condescending. So the most recent article contains phrases like, even the organisers do not seem to be burdened with much factual knowledge concerning the meanings of the pilgrimage or the history of the island. And this was absolutely a million miles from my experience. There's still such a kind of investment in community and boats as a form of community that this kind of annual event is a really, really big celebration of. So yeah, alongside this, paddling routes known as the Crooked Way. So in an attempt to kind of modernize the islands, so this is the kind of area that the bord omra and the hookers use kind of most of all. And in an attempt to modernize the islands, these kind of causeways were built. And when the causeways were very first built, they were built so that they could be opened so boats could go through. But a particular politician, again, in the 60s, decided it was too expensive to man the spot where the boats would go through. So replaced the causeways with ones that didn't move at all. And essentially meant that instead of being able to go between the little spots in this area, boats had to head round this known as the Crooked Way to carry things at all anymore, which was really, really, really exposed sea. So kind of taking these routes, that is clinging onto a little rock to go around the corner into those road routes, and hopefully it's just as disorienting as it actually felt to do so. But the ways in which kind of modern decisions like that, that politician is kind of remembered as an almost kind of demonic figure. His party has never been elected in the area since. That's how kind of strongly people are connected to their boats. But yeah, the story of that kind of these routes being closed down is kind of typical of these kind of things. So yeah, this kind of first chapter is asking what it means to research a boat that is such an elusive but useful kind of case study in the dynamics of kind of memory and forgetting, and kind of loss and survival. And the next case study is the rowed boats of the Isle of Lewis and Harris. So these islands are the center of these kind of big constellations of much smaller islands that were fundamentally part of kind of small Lewis communities, despite some of them being as much as 40 miles offshore. So like North Rona up there, which is one of the most spectacular spots in the world. North Rona was just as much a part of Ness community as the local playing fields. And this chapter focuses a tiny bit on the Sgornishek, which is the kind of the boat of Ness, that kind of northernmost region. People forget that the Sgornishek, even though it is a sailboat, began life as a rowing boat. It was only as the kind of islands kind of commercialized in the 18th century that the rowed Sgornishek gradually turned into the sailboat. But today they're all sailboats. And there are only two of them currently seaworthy. So this is heading out in one with their kind of biggest current champion, the poet Ian Stephen. But yeah, the kind of chapter is much more focusing on the rowed boats further south, but kind of getting involved as much as possible in the kind of local community heritage things. So leading kind of these heritage walks across the cliffs, the local organization where kind of old people who, many of whom hadn't been down to the rocks down here that their families used to fish off kind of 40 years ago, heading out with them, then kind of sharing stories of these places, and my role simply being to kind of convince them that these stories are important. And yeah, just kind of really kind of emotional kind of events, much more emotional than things historians like me usually kind of get to be involved in. And then kayaking up the rivers to the incredible kind of shealing sites in the interior. So you can often see dozens of these kind of shealing spots from a kind of good vantage, often beehive dwellings like these, that again have immense local significance. And like there's never been the remains of a boat found around these kind of shealing sites. They're often around the kind of big locks at the middle of the island, and they make no sense if they weren't connected by boats, if people weren't using kind of wooden boats between them. So we've got another kind of element of the kind of lost sense of how these operate because of the boats kind of not being taken very seriously. And yeah, there are now kind of no buildings, roads, or paths for many miles around, which is kind of why they've survived in the kind of condition that they have. Local people have done lots of work that they were willing to share to kind of map the shealing sites onto kind of families, coastal families, past and present, to kind of show how life in these kind of interconnected worlds kind of operated. But the stories that I most want to tell are about the communities from the islands and bays that are a little bit further south on the island's west coast. So outdoors nights kind of spent at places like Lochenstroim that I showed earlier, on islands like Yellow-Vellister, Little Bernera, and then Scarp. In the interest of time, I will skip to the last, which is Scarp. So Scarp was famous for producing the best rowers in this region. Its boats were the only style that are featured in the book that didn't actually have a specific name. So if you ask people about Scarp boats, there's like, oh, they're just the kind of boats we made. And like many of the places featured in the book, these kind of regions of Lewis have no trees. But like all of the North Atlantic, kind of being bounded as it is by huge subarctic boreal forests, driftwood is what made this area such a kind of arena of small boat cultures. So the significance of driftwood is generally drastically underappreciated. And it's one of the strange things to do with this region, that the most significant materials, driftwood, limpets, dogfish, are the most kind of drastically underappreciated. The ones that urban people who conducted statistical accounts just never thought to consider. It's one reason why working outdoors and talking to people invested in local memory reaches kind of places that archives don't. So Scarp boats were built on the island, usually by people with lots of different roles. So the most admired boat builder of the island's kind of last generation was the schoolmaster, Alan MacLean. And in the 1940s, he made extensive notes in Gaelic on island boat building. So he praised the intelligence and adaptability of islanders in making every kind of tool of their trades and furnishing houses with elegance and neatness, despite the condescension of outsiders who thought them backwards and stupid. And he noted a monetary economy on the ascendant, which made islanders less reliant on inherited skills. And he observed those skills kind of begin to pass into obscurity, and recalled an island saying that indicated the interconnectedness of all resources. If you have a sandworm, you have everything. And recalled the first time he heard someone say instead, if you have money, you have everything. And yeah, Maclean describes the whole community on spring days wandering down to the sea before daybreak in the hope of boatwood being washed ashore. They looked for oak for stem and stern, red fir for keel, grey elm for gunwales, and larch for ribs and planks. And he describes the long days of work that followed a find of wood. So soaking it in freshwater pools, then steaming it over fires. And he describes it really kind of vividly with the kind of crack and spark of the fires, ready to kind of be rendered into a boat's smooth curves. He wrote about learning by observing the older boat builders, described watching the saw pour dust over their faces and beards to what he called the sound of its strange music. And they'd have no privacy, so every action was closely watched with a kind of running commentary about other options for form and function. And every resulting vessel would be unique, but with enough in common that the identity of the boat builder would be immediately clear. So he wrote that if a Scott boat had a sweet running line from the keel to the gunwale, it would be a source of great pride for those brave, skilled, good-humoured islanders. And it's worth noting how many of the celebrated boat people were also kind of community matriarchs too. So one of Maclean's friends described being terrified when caught in a storm in a rowing boat with his aunt, kind of feeling in real danger. And instead of kind of rowing into the island, she took him further out into the water and used it as a time for a lesson on how to deal with kind of big swell on the waves. And yeah, he writes about that as the most terrifying experience of his whole life. Now, the last permanent residents left Scarp in 1971, and Maclean's old home is now a ruin. But in the 1940s, he spoke of the Gallic culture of Scarp in terms that didn't permit despair. He said, though the wind is so much against us just now, who knows but that it may change again before the boat sinks altogether. So using the links to the island of current residents of Lewis and Harris and the way they, by small boat, maintain crofting tenure there. This chapter is kind of trying to show that the boat of Scarp hasn't sunk, and that given the right kind of political conditions, there's hope for the island's legacy. Then the third chapter takes a geographical leap to Scandinavia and to Sapmi. As many will know, this is the kind of the region of the Sami people onto which the modern borders of Sweden and Norway, Finland and Russia have been imposed. So like almost everywhere else in the book, including Lewis, communities were highly mobile and lived in different kinds of environments season by season. So national borders are a really serious problem for Sami life. And there are festivals like St. Tryphon's Day, where small Sami boats reenact elements of the mobility that our borders barred. In the 17th century, the idea was invented that there are three kinds of Sami: forest Sami, coastal Sami, and mountain Sami. In reality, these were kind of different inflections of overlapping ways of life. So most Sami, not just mountain Sami, relied on reindeer herds. Most Sami, not just coastal Sami, relied on small boats and shoreline resources. And in fact, early sources associate Sami with boats at least as much as with reindeer. The Norse sources heap praise on the boats Sami were hired to build for Norse leaders. Early modern travellers, whether by river or sea, describe Sami boats in detail and recount jaw-dropping feats of Sami seafaring. But in the 1870s and 80s, a really kind of big shift occurred, partly to do with state building endeavours. Suddenly, the idea of the Sami was equated only with the mountain Sami and reindeer. Coastal Sami began to be presented not as a distinctive style of being Sami, but as compromised, inauthentic, and neither fully Sami nor modern subjects. So it happens at a really specific moment. So there's a big kind of international exhibition held in the 1870s where coastal Sami are really present and have specific roles. And then when an 1890s exhibition is held, only Norwegians are associated with the sea, and Sami are just associated with reindeers. So these processes, like Norwegianization, attempted to force Sami into the modern state, shorn of language and told to be ashamed of their culture. And then at the end of the Second World War, retreating Nazi forces burnt boats, boathouses, and other infrastructure on a huge scale. So for these reasons, coastal Sami boats are kind of a really, really threatened and precarious kind of tradition. So where that Galway hooker in an earlier photo, Antonai, was built in the 1870s, every single Sami boat on Norwegian seas today has been built since 2017. Today, there's only one Sami builder of coastal boats in northern Norway called Hans Hansen. That's in his workshop. So he has lots of kind of helpers, but no one yet who can take over. He currently has funding from the Sami Parliament to take an apprentice, although a suitable one hasn't been found. So yeah, visiting him in his workshop, which is the basement of the Coastal Sami Resource Centre in Porsangerfjord, and they extremely kindly lent me a Sami boat for all the time I was in the region. So I rowed this for a week or so, exploring the huge fjord with over 200 islands in it, and yeah, just a place that's the absolute heart of Sami life. They had longer summers, the islands in the fjord, and more resources than the rest of the region, and were therefore kind of immensely culturally significant. So spending my nights on these under absolutely stunning skies. And yeah, there are lots of kind of identifiable remains, groups of kind of pre-war boathouses in these regions. You can see just how kind of big some of the previous boats must have been, and plenty of kind of current boat use on all the banks as well. So kind of heading from Hammerfest around into Porsangerfjord, and then doing this part of the journey with the little rowboat. So yeah, since the 1970s, there's been a lot of research into Sami engagement with place through communal practices like berry gathering, kind of, yeah, piecing together kind of interactions between kind of people and landscape. But what's kind of been forgotten through lots of this is the kind of degree of knowledge and place law required to actually build Sami boats. So every single material in the boat, as I said earlier, kind of coming from the pine trees, so pine planks, pine tar to treat the planks, pine root to sew it together. And the gathering and preparation of pine root is a really kind of intensive practice. It can be done in such a way as to encourage a tree's growth rather than damage it, but in ways that require kind of real woodcraft. So it's that's the very last skill of Sami boat building to be put back into this revival. So the boat I had did have some iron in it, but the next boats they're building are going to be kind of all pine. So yeah, learning the Sami boat as a way to kind of learn the fjord and talk to local people about how specific places were conceptualized was a way of trying to place the small boat, in the cultural and kind of ecological context. And I've never been anywhere quite so wildlife rich. So pods of porpoise that were just hundreds strong, and then flocks of mergansers that were absolutely vast. And these were all kind of things that were used in Sami life. So the merganser flocks, for instance, if you place traps under the water where you know the mergansers are going to land, then all the fish are going to go straight down as the traps when the mergansers do. So kind of used like that to catch fish. And otters also used to catch fish as well. So a whole way of kind of engaging with the environment that's very, very different from Western cultures. And then fourth brief case study, I'm overstaying my welcome here, is the Faroese boat. I will just say a tiny, very, very tiny bit about this. So again, I was able to borrow one of these beautiful things for kind of rowing through the kind of inner fjords, the kind of safe areas that are kind of much more kind of transport routes than the land actually is in Faroe, for reasons you can probably see. But doing the actual circumnavigation of the Faroe Islands in my little pack raft, and reading kind of heaps of the Faroese literature as I kind of headed around these spaces. So there's a there's just an incredible vocabulary to do with boats in Faroese language. These are Norse influenced boats, but kind of quite different from Norse boats in most other places. I remember hearing of a Faroese boat builder being asked if what he was building was a Viking ship, and just saying, it's not a ship and I'm not a Viking. So yeah, really distinctive in the specific shapes, this kind of smooth upwards shears. In the names for parts of them as well, they have this really vivid vocabulary of things like the kind of gooseneck here. Yeah, also like just the thole pins that you brace the oars against. The parts of those are known as like the beard, the feet, the nose. So you just imagine this little person there helping you out as you row. Just such a kind of vivid vocabulary. You don't need to read far into the Faroese literature to find just this idea that Faroese children are born with oars in their hands, and lots of kind of just folklore surrounding the idea that Faroese people are such good kind of conversationalists and rowers that they can all be kind of rowing and laughing as they row a boat of 8 people without anyone kind of breaking a stroke. And the idea that being in a boat is kind of the ultimate kind of quality time. Being together with someone out in a boat is the way of having a kind of good whole day conversation. Being at sea here was different from anywhere else too. So usually I can row or paddle up to an island without drawing much attention. But in Faroe, people, often children, constantly gathered. The informal economy here is still so strong. People, when going and visiting Faroese people, constantly kind of just getting an immense sense of their pride in feeding me the things that they kind of grown or caught. And also I never went into a Faroese home without being shown translations of British nature writing in either Danish or sometimes even Faroese. So just kind of, yeah, a culture still kind of deeply ecologically connected to these kind of things. So just to briefly kind of bring kind of all of this together very quickly, the purpose is to kind of try and see historical change from the perspective of these small boat communities, always at the edges with national borders either a kind of irrelevance or a nuisance, always places where excavations are improbable and archives unrepresentative, to write histories in which big cities are distant and remote, and in so doing, to see how wildly different our narratives of the modern world might look. So I believe deeply in the faith that can be placed in orality and shared memory in places with strong oral tradition. And yeah, there's no way of sitting down with a dictaphone to kind of draw these stories out, but doing things with materials together, whether gathering spruce roots or steaming planks or pulling oars, that's just a way to generate storytelling and kind of learn these things. So these are often places where, probably all places, where research is actually quite a dirty word, and where claiming any kinds of expertise would be really frowned upon, but where there's nonetheless a kind of real appetite to have these stories told and remembered and celebrated, as long as it doesn't seem to be done through lenses crafted in inland urban centres. So yeah, that's hopefully an introduction to how the boat is kind of the object of study and the medium of study and kind of everything else in between. Sorry I went on too long, but thank you very, very much for listening.
Stunning. So I think lots of us are thinking, how can we get more boats into our research? But do we have any questions either in the room or online?
Sorry. Oh, thanks so much.
Really fascinated about lives as an archaeologist. So it's the question, but just is there any indication of like the role in like death, burial, some of these days like carrying on so important early assumptions to carry on to breathing as well?
So in Sami culture, there are really strong associations. So like the sewing of the boat, the boat is kind of the prestige sewing situation. And when someone dies, you unsew clothing, you unsew boats. Like the boats have this incredible kind of symbolism surrounding death still. I don't know of that many other places where that still persists. The breaking up of kayaks in Greenland is, again, has kind of strong, really strong associations. I'm trying to think of any examples of kind of people being buried with boatish things in other places like Highland or Lewis or anywhere. But yeah, those kind of associations are really strong. And I don't know how much people draw into the fact that tools are shared between coffin makers and boat builders too. But yeah, all kinds of things.
I have one, and so just thinking back to Nicola Dillon, both she was talking about the keels made for the cliff faces, and you used this really beautiful term, sort of expressions of landscape, and thinking of the idea of landscape volatility, so thinking cliff erosion, changing tides. How quickly do we see sort of changes in the boats in response to the landscape, or is there a bit of reluctance of we've always made boats like this, so we don't want to change it? Sort of that kind of dynamic.
So that is completely different in all of these places. There are some places that have incredibly kind of strong traditions that don't want to change anything. I don't know if there are people from any of these regions or people online, but if I generalize about those connections, I will probably offend people. But like Fair Isle, for instance, long-term kind of similarity of shapes of boats. Whereas somewhere like Greenland, every boat is kind of built to the shape of the person who's using it. There aren't kind of formal measurements, but just measurements by body part, and you build them kind of by body part. Things change really rapidly in the way that kayaks are built. And there are other boat traditions that change quickly like that too. The song boats change. So there's the different cultural logics to whether things should change or shouldn't in each kind of place. Partly depending on the reliability of the things that they're built with.